Hi there, hope you're well. In this video we're going to be taking a closer look at loose tenons, not just the Festool Domino, but loose tenons generally, and of course you can't just talk about loose tenons without also talking about mortise and tenons. We'll also give an honourable mention to Dowels, and of course we will take a very brief look at the Festool Domino, the tool that has done much to popularise loose tenons in recent times. I did have somebody come out to me the other day and say, very earnestly, did I know that Festool invented the loose tenon? Pretty sure they didn't. The loose tenons have been around for thousands of years, literally loose tenons and mortise and tenons, both used by the ancient Egyptians, and not just in woodwork, but in stonework and blacksmithing as well. A little more recently, the sarsen stones in Stonehenge were held together by fairly rudimentary mortise and tenons. Can't help but think that if they'd used a domino and a bit more glue, they might still all be standing. And then more recently, again, the Phoenicians used pegged loose tenons in their shipbuilding to the extent that it became known as the Phoenician joint. More recently, though, in the last sort of 14 years or so, since Festool have launched the domino and the domino loose tenoning machine, it's probably brought the loose tenon to more people. Certainly more people have been made aware of loose tenons during the last 14 years than they have done previously. Let's take a quick look at loose tenons, starting with mortise and tenons, and see how they differ. So loose tenons, mortise and tenons, kind of related, cut from the same cloth. Both used fairly extensively on a smaller scale in sort of T-type joins like this, where you're joining a rail to a leg on a chair or a table or something like that, and on a bigger scale in timber frame buildings, that kind of thing, where you're joining an upright to a horizontal. The tenon itself is fashioned from one of the workpieces, typically about a third of the thickness, and if you're a shoddy cabinet maker like me or joiner, then you also continue the shoulders of the tenon around so that you actually reduce the size of the tenon. That just means that the mortise edges in the corresponding piece are actually then hidden by the shoulder, and those two just sort of sit together neatly like that. This is what's called a stub tenon, so it doesn't go all the way through. In a through tenon it would come out of the other side, and you could wedge that as well as adding adhesive or some other form of fixing. On a stub tenon like this, all you can really do apart from gluing it is to put a peg through it, sometimes called a draw bore, where you bore a hole through it, but you have the hole slightly further back in the tenon so that as you drive the peg through, it pulls the joint tightly. That's basically how the Phoenicians use their loose tenons. Loose tenons are similar, but instead of having a mortise on one side and a tenon on the other, you actually flip that around and you have a mortise in both ends. Then you have a loose or floating tenon, sometimes called, that sits between them in one side like this and in the other like this, and then you get a much simpler joint that's almost as strong, especially if, like the Phoenicians, you also put a peg through that to pull the whole thing tight. Obviously, one of the big advantages of a loose tenon like this is that we've got much less finishing to do on the shoulder, on the end of the workpiece. The workpiece length is the same as whatever the distance is between the two legs, so you don't have to add in the length of the tenon. And of course it's much easier to finish a single face like this than it is to finish all four shoulders of a tenon like this. Yes, you can get commercial four-sided tenoners, that they're generally beyond the scope of most of us. Most of us are just hacking these out. I did this one very quickly on the bandsaw yesterday, and yes, it is the first, I think it's possibly the second loose tenon that I've done in about 45 years. I'm quite happy with that, actually. It's worked out surprisingly well. I definitely need some more practice, but not bad at all. Fairly obviously, on joints like this, you can see the benefit of the loose tenon, but when it comes to cabinetry, those benefits increase significantly. Now, when it comes to modern cabinetry, if you like, in man-made boards, obviously it's not beyond the wit of man to cut a nice level shoulder like this, although it took a few goes on the bandsaw and track saw combined. But the reality is that the little stub tenons that you let left behind are made of the core of the material, and even with a decent quality MRMDF like this, they're just not that strong. So this is where Festool's Domino really comes into its own, by providing a really strong, structurally sound loose tenon from beech. It provides a solid fixing between two faces, particularly for a sort of an L kind of joint that you get in cabinetry generally. Now you might well be looking at this and thinking, well, hang on a minute, what about dowels? You did a whole video about dowels and about how great they were and how cheap they are, and it's true, they are. No fancy tools required, just a drill and a bit and a cheap little jig like this maybe, and you're in business. There's two areas where dowels really don't work particularly well compared to loose tenons. One is simple glue area. The glue area on a dowel is entirely around its circumference. To get that glue to bond properly, you've got to have good contact all around that joint. So you take a 6mm dowel like this one and pop it in a 6mm hole like this, and that's a really snug fit even without glue. Add glue in there and it'll be fantastic. But the reality is, if you want any kind of wiggle room, any kind of flexibility, you're completely out of luck. It's a very economical connector, but it demands precision. A 6mm dowel in an 8mm hole will give you plenty of wiggle room, but all the glue in the world won't make that a strong joint. The other thing, compared to dominoes, compared to loose tenons, this is a 5mm loose tenon and a 6mm dowel, is that if you take the dowel and roll it along, its entire glue area is only equivalent to 1/2 of that 5mm domino. So the domino has twice as much glue area. That's critical, the fact that the glue area is on both sides of the domino, because that's the other little bit of Festool genius which made the domino particularly good for this kind of cabinetry work. So what Festool managed to do when they made the domino is that they not only gave you a loose tenon machine that's incredibly versatile, they made it very easy to give yourself a slightly wider slot. You have the choice of three: the narrow setting, which is the same as whichever domino you're using, a mid setting, which gives you plus or minus a couple of millimeters, and a wider setting, which gives you a little bit more wiggle room again. Because all the strength in a loose tenon comes from the face, not around the edges, the wider slot really doesn't affect the strength of the joint at all. And what it meant is that you can very quickly and very easily use it to join, to make simple L joints in cabinetry like this. The Festool system has little pins to register against the edge of the board to put the mortise in at the same place every time. So there's not even much measuring and marking, and using the domino earlier to cut these mortises, they're a nice snug fit on the narrow setting, and they're an easy fit with a little bit of wiggle room on the mid setting, and that gives you the perfect joint. It's a precision tool that lets you work loosely, and that's an absolute godsend in a commercial workshop where you're working quickly, or perhaps for, you know, keen amateurs, people a little newer to woodworking who perhaps might not have the skill set to work as precisely as they'd like. Of course, it is possible to make a narrow mortise in both faces, but that makes, you know, for a very, very, very tight joint for no real benefit. That just shows up, you know, the any mismatches in the original cabinetry, in the original cutting of the timber. It's a very tight joint. Now you might be looking at that and thinking, well, hang on a sec, if the mid setting is so good, why not do a mid setting on both mortises? Then it will be even easier. It doesn't actually work particularly well, because if you put a domino or a loose tenon in the middle, there's nothing really to support it and keep it steady. So as you put that domino into those mortises, as you try and move them around, they can jam up a little bit. It does give you a little bit more movement, it does give you a little bit more wiggle room, but in all honesty, I would put a narrow mortise into the edge of the board and a mid-sized mortise into the face of the board, because that's going to give you the best combination of ease of use and just enough wiggle room to be able to carry on with your work without too many problems. So clearly, loose tenons generally and Festool's Domino in particular offer many benefits, many advantages in small-scale cabinetry and carcass production, whether that's a one-man band maker installer or perhaps an advanced hobbyist looking to make the most of their time in the workshop. It's an extremely flexible system. The connectors are relatively affordable at 3 or 4 pence a piece. And it's just an extremely versatile machine. I have absolutely no regrets in buying one for my workshop. But there is, of course, the small matter of the fact that it costs around £750 these days to purchase one of these. And that simply puts it beyond the means of many people. Wouldn't it be great, though, if there was some kind of, a jig and router system that enabled you to get loose tenons compatible with Festool's own Domino, that also used a pin registration system that minimized the measuring and marking, and also allowed you to use both narrow and mid-sized slots to put your mortises in to give you that little bit of extra wiggle room. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, be sure to join me next week when I'll be showcasing the 10-minute workshop loose tenon jig. I'll leave it there for this one though. Thank you ever so much for taking a look. Thank you as always to my amazing Patreon supporters whose continued support has enabled me along this very rocky road to bring this product to market. And also thanks ever so much to Paul from Steel City Drone Pilot. Great channel. Paul very kindly allowed me to use his drone footage from Stonehenge. Go and check him out. He's also on Instagram. I'll put the links all down below. But that's it for this one. Thanks ever so much for taking a look, and I'll see you next week. Take care.